floor is yours.
Thank you. So I'm Andy. I'm going to start us off, and I'll be talking for, I don't know, 15 minutes or so, and then Sergi will take over, doing the more difficult parts of the paper. So yeah, thank you very much for giving us a chance to talk about this work that we've been doing on this question of equality amongst speakers of English. I think it'll probably help for me just to say a few things about the title. So by speakers of English, we mean both people who speak English as an L1, so people for whom it is their mother tongue or their first language, and also people who speak English as an additional language, so speak or use English as an L2. We also are inclusive about the variety of English that one uses, so standardized varieties right through to all varieties that might be recognized as versions of English by their speakers. And the broad kind of issue with which we're concerned is that if you take that big set of people who speak English as an L1 or as an L2, and they speak some variety of English, if that's your set of people, what would it mean for all of those people to be equal with one another? And the way in which we approach that is to try and think about the inequalities that one might expect to find amongst that set of people, as I've just defined them, to distinguish amongst them and try and make a bit of progress on thinking about which of those inequalities are more or less significant. I'm just trying to switch slides. Yeah, it is letting me know. Okay. So in a nutshell, we're asking how egalitarians specifically should try to characterize the various inequalities that you find in the world amongst speakers of English. And we do this by developing a pluralist theory of global linguistic inequality. I think sometimes when people think about the linguistic inequalities that we see in light of the spread of English, sometimes they think in terms of one really important central inequality. So sometimes people think that the fundamental global linguistic inequality is inequality of power, right? That the military or economic might behind the United States has meant that English is spread, and that sort of the relations between different English speakers in the world today are really kind of reflecting these kind of neo-colonial dynamics. And it's not that we think that there's anything particularly objectionable about that kind of story, but it's not very nuanced. And so what we're trying to do is distinguish amongst the different ways in which speakers of English might be unequal. One of the important outcomes of our argument, or one of the significant implications, is that once you try to disaggregate this phenomena of global linguistic inequality, it becomes clear that inequalities amongst English speakers have as much to do with language attitudes and language ideologies as they do to do with, say, procedures or institutions or language rights. And that carries implications, I think, for how we think about linguistic justice more generally. One view about linguistic justice that I think has been in the ascendancy over the last few decades is to say that what we really should be focusing on is getting the background rules right, getting the institutions right, coming up with the correct theory of language rights. This is kind of view I associate with the proceduralism of Alan Paton, for example. And it's not part of the theory of linguistic justice to be too concerned about outcomes, about which languages flourish and which ones decline, for example. And something that's kind of implied by our analysis, I think, is that if you are an egalitarian, if you're committed to the value of equality, then linguistic justice must be more than merely procedural. It must also have to do with people's attitudes and to do with language ideologies. Yeah, I'm not able to go on to the next slide, Sergi. Could you? Yeah, okay. So the structure of the talk can be in three parts. I'll start by talking about global linguistic inequality and try and define it. Then I'll say a few things about distributive and relational egalitarianisms, and then Sergi will take over and he will talk about 9 dimensions of global linguistic inequality. Could you put us on to the next slide? Thank you. So global linguistic inequality. So global linguistic inequalities are linguistic inequalities. And by linguistic inequality, we mean an inequality that arises when social or linguistic circumstances differentially reward particular language skills or identities. So one way to think about this is to think that each of us has a language repertoire. We have a list of languages we can speak to different kind of levels or abilities. That repertoire will fit with our linguistic environment in some way. Better or worse, depending on the content of our repertoire and depending on what's in the linguistic environment, which languages are recognized and used by others, for example. And inequality emerges depending on whether your fit is better or worse for your linguistic environment. Global linguistic inequalities are this kind of special kind of linguistic inequality for which the explanation of the inequality has something to do with the global language system. And in particular, we're focusing on the spread of English as part of that global language system. Importantly, for an inequality to be a global linguistic inequality, one of the ones that we're interested in, it doesn't necessarily have to be the case that people are situated in different countries or different states. You might have a global linguistic inequality amongst people who inhabit the same neighborhood, the same country, as long as the inequality between them is explained by, at least in part, the global language system. So this very general idea of global linguistic inequalities, you can already find it, I think, in a lot of empirical work. It's there, for instance, in sociolinguistic work on the idea of unequal Englishes, on some Englishes and English speakers being valued more than others. You find it in the background of these discussions about native speakerism. It's obviously there in discussions of linguistic imperialism or more generally in these discussions about the effect of globalization and especially sort of the hegemonic power of the United States on the spread of English globally. Could you pass us on again, Sergi, please? Right, so to focus attention in the rest of the discussion, we're going to focus quite a lot on what I'm going to call a central case of global linguistic inequality. A central case amongst two speakers of English, right, defined as I did before. And what happens in a central case is that there are two simultaneous equality jeopardizing mechanisms in play. One of these mechanisms has to do with prestige, with the fact that some varieties of English are perceived as more prestigious, at least in some settings, than others, and some as less prestigious. And the other equality jeopardizing mechanism we have in mind, it has to do with whether or not you're speaking English as a first language or if it is an L2. So a simple example of a global linguistic inequality in which both of those equality jeopardizing mechanisms are present. Suppose you've got two people competing for the same job, let's say within the tech industry in North America. One of those people is an L1 English speaker who grew up in an inner circle context. The other person speaks English with a perceived accent, learnt it as a second language, perhaps learnt it in an outer or expanding circle context. Let's suppose there's an inequality of some kind. We'll come on to the kinds in a moment between those two people. What you've got there are the two mechanisms in play simultaneously, right? The prestige mechanism as well as the L1, L2 mechanism. Because there are these two simultaneous mechanisms in play, that will sometimes mean that there are global linguistic inequalities where only one of the mechanisms is in operation. So just as a simple illustration of this, imagine you've got two academics speaking at a conference, one Danish, one English. Both of them are speaking what are perceived by others to be highly fluent and competent versions of English in broadly similar ways. So there aren't sort of strong prestige effects in play, but there's still an inequality in the sense that one of them is speaking their first language and the other is speaking a language, a second language. Likewise, another kind of variant, I guess, on the central case is when there's only prestige effects in play. So you have two L1 English speakers, perhaps one from an inner circle and one from an outer circle context, and yet there is variation in the prestige of the two languages. And still, that's a global linguistic inequality by our account because one of the mechanisms is in play. And then finally, there are these kind of complicated cases, which we won't say very much about later, but are worth noting, where the two mechanisms might be working against one another. So for instance, if you've got an L2 English speaker using a higher prestige variety of English than an L1 English speaker. So for example, someone speaking African-American vernacular English as an L1 as their first language, compared with a North European who, let's say, has attended an international school and has a very sort of professional sounding or standardized sounding variety of English, right? So the two mechanisms in that case are working in different directions. Okay, thank you, Sergi. Right, so we've got the idea of a global linguistic inequality, and the bulk of our paper is attempting to disaggregate that phenomenon of a global linguistic inequality by breaking it down into a set of 9 separate inequalities, and to show why global linguistic inequality is therefore such a complex phenomenon. I should have said, by the way, earlier that when we present this list of 9 that Sergi is going to be speaking about later, that's not intended as a comprehensive list. It's an invitation to other people to supplement or to add additional things to it. So it's really a starting point in a conversation rather than a conclusion. Anyway, what we're trying to do is use sort of contemporary egalitarian political theory to help us to distinguish amongst the different dimensions of global linguistic inequality. So in order to sort of explain the logic of that, I need to take a step back so as to sort of fill you in on the kinds of theories that we're drawing upon. So much egalitarian theory historically has been distributive. So for distributive egalitarians, equality is basically a pie slicing game. And equality is about ensuring that people have equal shares of something that we care about. And there's been a great deal of debate amongst egalitarians about what that thing is. What is it that we're trying to equalize? I won't be speaking about that, but it is interesting that within the linguistic justice literature, that debate has been mirrored to some extent. And linguistic justice theorists have proposed different answers to the question of what is it we think should be equalized in order to ensure that speakers of different languages or different language varieties are equal to one another. So the most influential answer to that question that I'm aware of is Alan Patton's answer, which is effectively recognition, which he cashes out in terms of resources, rights, and institutional support for languages. So we distribute recognition equally. That's what we should be doing as a theory of linguistic justice. A slightly different answer you can find in Elder Discuter's work, whereby the thing that we are trying to equalize are these normatively significant interests that people have in their languages or in languages more generally. Still a different answer that you find implied by things like the capabilities approach is what we should be trying to distribute equally is the capability to flourish. So we should adjust our linguistic environment so as to ensure that everybody has an equal capability to flourish. It's a view that Sergi has defended in early work, as have I. And still another view is preference satisfaction, a view defended by Brian Carey. What we do in the paper is identify 5 goods whose distribution seems to be really important and can be affected by the global language system. And we think that if we're really committed to ensuring that speakers of English are equals, then we should be interested in how these goods are distributed. Sergi will talk about them in detail, but they are, in short, access to opportunities, extent to which you receive resources or supports or services for a language or a language variety, the efforts one puts into additional language learning, how the global language system affects your dignity or esteem, as well as how it affects your ability to make meaning, to express meaning to others. And all of those are goods that can be distributed, we think, by the global language system. And if we're committed to equality amongst speakers of English, then we should be interested in how those goods are distributed. The other strand, if you could pass on now to the next slide, sorry, Sergi. The other strand of egalitarian thinking that we draw upon is relational egalitarianism. So anyone familiar with contemporary egalitarian political thought will recognize this. In the last couple of decades, a number of political thinkers, for various different reasons, have expressed dissatisfaction with the dominant distributive paradigm in egalitarian political thinking and in theorizing about justice more generally. They've said that it's too soulless, or that it misses the point about what makes an egalitarian society valuable. And that instead we ought to be focusing on the quality of the relationships that people enjoy with one another. So equality on this view is a property of relationships as opposed to distributions. Interestingly, a number of linguistic justice scholars have also expressed dissatisfaction about the distributive paradigm in theorizing about linguistic justice. So they've criticized what I think of as a dominant distributive approaches, but those thinkers haven't yet developed a full relational theory of linguistic justice. And so the thing that we're trying to do in this paper is to sketch out what such a theory might want to include by focusing on this special case of the relationships amongst English speakers. And in particular, we suggest that if we're interested in bringing about conditions of equality amongst speakers of English, then we should be trying to ensure that they can relate to one another as moral equals, as epistemic equals, as social equals, and on egalitarian aesthetic terms. So I think that's everything I have to say, and I will hand over now to Sergi. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. So the idea, as Andy was just mentioning, is that drawing on these 2 different ways to talk about egalitarian political theory. In the next slides, we will try to identify in a way and also to discuss and offer some remedies to these 9 possible inequalities in this global linguistic system that might affect or that might generate inequalities between speakers of English, right? So 5 of those are on the distributive side, as you can see here, and the other 4 are on the relational side. So it will take a bit of time now, so I will try to explain each of these 9 different dimensions in the following 20-25 minutes, and then conclude the talk. So first of all, access to opportunities. So many activities that are relevant, that are important to people, like, for example, I don't know, attending college, finding a good job, advancing careers, forming meaningful relationships with other people. All of these things depend in a way on being able to use, understand a language or different languages, especially languages in which those opportunities are available to people. So in this sense, the spread of English all over the planet has created inequalities not only between people who speak English and those who do not, but also between people for whom English is an L1, and people for whom language is not an L1. It's an additional language. And also between those who speak like high prestige or inner circle English and those who speak like low mobility or low prestige or so-called low prestige um, a variety of English, right? So there are a number of mechanisms in this sense through which unequal access to opportunities among the speakers of English have been produced and reinforced. And some of these involved explicit forms of discrimination, like for instance, when jobs in language-related industries are reserved, like for so-called native speakers, like for instance in English language schools or in I don't know people that proofread or copywriting, etc. But also some informal mechanisms that can also play a role in reproducing or producing these inequalities amongst English speakers, such as when multinational corporations, for instance, reward apparent native speakers for being perceived as more persuasive, convincing, impressive communicators, and so forth. So to face that problem, some linguistic justice scholars have suggested that equalizing opportunities among speakers of different languages will require some combination of different elements. So for instance, supplementary language acquisition for those disadvantaged in this situation. Also adopting a more, let's say, pluricentric understanding of English that accepts a greater language variety, not only like prominent, prestigious, or so-called prestigious English varieties, and also modifications to the social structure, such as when governments commit to securing new employment or educational opportunities in a minority language, or when it passes legislation to discourage linguistic discrimination. Another distributive inequality, as was mentioned by Andy before, and it's quite common also in the linguistic justice literature, is the unequal provision of linguistic resources, supports, and services. So for instance, this is quite typical in multinational states. There are a lot of literature on that. Like when in multinational states, there might be disparities, differences in the languages used by public services, healthcare, education, or communication with civil servants, officials, etc. So similar inequalities that happen in multinational states can also be found at the global level, no? Specifically between English speakers and everybody else. For instance, English speakers tend to enjoy greater share of resources, support, and services than speakers of other languages, while living in countries where English is only one of a number of recognized or official languages, but also even in countries where English is not recognized at all, but still English speakers can have access to linguistic resources and support, even though English is not officially recognized in that context. Additionally, there are also inequalities within English-speaking communities, especially between native, like L1 English speakers, and those who speak English as a L2, as an additional language. So L1 speakers benefit from accessing services and support in their own language, while L2 speakers often face challenges in navigating services in a second languages. Even among English speakers, those using standard varieties may be privileged over speakers of non-standards or like lower prestige dialects or variants of English, such as African American Vernacular English or Appalachian English, because only in most contexts, standard forms of English are typically used in public services. So as was the case for access opportunities, linguistic justice theories have already developed theories to how to address domestically these kind of inequalities between speakers of different languages for the same society. The most influential of these proposals is the one that was mentioned before by Andy, Alan Patton's equal recognition model. So Patton recommends in this case, for domestic context, offering graduate levels of support to a range of official recognized languages, depending in this case on the number of speakers. So allowing in this case for differential service provision depending on the numbers of each language, etc. In this sense, this model could also apply, we argue, to English-speaking to the English-speaking global world, for instance, English-speaking migrants, offering services in different varieties of English, not only in standard varieties, and addressing the needs of speakers of English that speak English as an L2. However, there is a problem here is that such policies might be conflictual or contentious or problematic in some contexts, as they could be seen as a kind of competing with the support for local or national languages. So there is also problems here with this kind of accommodation policies. Third, a very different global distributive inequality that arises amongst English speakers concerns. English speakers concerns unequal language learning effort sites, since in this case, if English is to function as a global lingua franca, then people will have to invest significant time, energy, even money in learning English as an L2, efforts that are not equally shared or that are not required by English speakers that has English as an L1, as a first language, as a mother tongue. So in this sense, a potential inequality that is usually neglected in the linguistic justice literature, but that we try to incorporate here, is between L1 English speakers who use different varieties of English. So in international fora or in inner cycle contexts, speakers originally from outer cycle contexts, like where, that are not USA or the United Kingdom, etc., might be expected to conform to inner circle norms. A pressure that is rarely felt in the opposite direction, the other way around. So learning how to adapt one's speech and manners to the so-called high prestige English is time consuming and involves kind of cognitive and other kind of burdens that are not equally shared by so-called high prestige speakers of English. So when it comes to addressing this kind of inequalities in learning efforts, the main solution recommended in the literature is requiring L1 English speakers to financially compensate, like for instance, paying higher taxes, people who learn English as an additional language. This is, for instance, Philippe Bampare's proposal. But this solution is unlikely to be appropriate or good for inequalities amongst L1 speakers of English, since it could add a kind of insult, injury, to compensate people for speaking a variant that is perceived as deficient, right? So for such cases, it would surely be better to move in the direction of, in a way, dismantling, eliminating, diminishing the relevant linguistic hierarchies that situates one way to speak English as better than other ways to speak English. Now, for instance, by encouraging the adoption of a more pluricentric ethos or greater tolerance of different varieties of English. So another distributive inequality that it's often discussed in the literature is this idea of unequal dignity or unequal esteem. For instance, both the political theorists Philippe Bamparais and Helder de Schutter have argued in different publications that a language regime granting preferential status to the majority language or the majority languages of one place can jeopardize the dignity of the speakers of minoritized language of this very same context. So in a similar way, we could apply this logic, this idea, to inequalities attributable to the global language system, right? So, for example, Stephen May, the social linguist Stephen May, argues that the adoption of English as a global lingua franca could cause L1 speakers of languages other than English to perceive their own languages in a negative way, right? Negatively, as a consequence of English being like continually constructed as a language of, let's say, wider communication, instrumentally useful, etc., and the other languages being perceived or being constructed or being viewed as merely carriers of tradition, heritage, identity, historical identity, etc. Additionally, a further global linguistic inequality might arise when particular varieties of English, such as those spoken in the inner circle, are socially privileged. There may be, in a way, ensuring the dignity of speakers of varieties that are perceived as less prestigious, right? So reducing these dignity, esteem, inequalities will require addressing how recognition is distributed amongst different languages and language varieties in this case within English. So some scholars, such as Stephen May, again, believe that the spread of English is incompatible with this equal recognition. But at the same time, some other people disagree. For instance, Philippe Amparais argues that since the spread of English is not due to the supposed intrinsic superiority on the part of English and English speakers, the esteem of speakers of other languages might be bolstered, might be promoted by taking opportunities to symbolically affirm the value of all languages, right? So it's possible to equally recognize different languages, etc. So this very same proposal might be applied maybe to different varieties of English, not only between different languages vis-a-vis English, but also between different varieties of English. And the fifth one, a final distributive inequality produced by this global language system has to do with whether a person can effectively convey meaning and make sense of their own experiences in a variety of English. So expressive inequalities typically arise between L1 English speakers and people who learn English as an additional language, right? Since the later group may have to expend greater efforts in speaking and writing and doing other stuff in English, enduring or promoting in a way high levels of fatigue, frustration, the risk of being misunderstood due, for instance, having a more limited range of linguistic resources, like for vocabulary size, or having less vocabulary size, less familiarity with the language and with the idioms and grammatical knowledge of the language, etc. So in this sense, expressive inequalities often occur due to how listeners perceive people speaking English as an additional language. So for in this case, as a philosopher, Amandine Català has observed in a paper published some years ago, people using an additional language, especially English, are often misunderstood not because of what they are trying to express, but because of how they are expressing themselves. And this might be because they import, for instance, expressive or rhetorical norms from their first language that are not recognized, or even that might confuse English-speaking listeners, right? So to face that, this problem, there seem to be three options available, right, for reducing this kind of expressive inequality. So first, people for whom English is an additional language might be offered relief from the burden of having to speak or write in English, or for instance, by the provision of translation or interpretation services. Second, with time and practices, some of these disadvantages may be, especially those faced by speakers of English as an additional language, might be less pronounced, right? So the more you practice in a language that is different than your own, the more you can feel at home in a way using that language. And finally, communicative norms and language ideologies might be transformed with a view empowering listeners to better appreciate and understand diverse varieties of English. So let's move now to relational linguistic inequalities, right? Actually, the most common way of thinking about this relational equality is in a way as requiring mutual recognition of equal moral standing, right? In particular, a person, we consider that people relate as each other as moral equals when people has a disposition to treat other people's interests on a par with their own, right? So I treat your interest at the same level that I would treat my own personal interest or the interest of my own group, etc. In this sense, a paradigmatic way in which egalitarian relationships might be compromised is when one party to this relationship between two speakers suffers domination, right? Since dominated people are vulnerable to having their interests disregarded in a way. Consequently, some relational egalitarians quite recently have begun to incorporate a concern for with domination into their theoretical prospects, drawing especially on the neo-Republican definition of domination popularized by a philosopher called Philip Pettit, right? This definition of domination involves, in a way, being defensively susceptible to arbitrary interference from others with power over us, right? So domination takes place when someone has the uncontrolled power to interfere on your decision without taking into consideration your own interest. So this has led some linguistic justice scholars to develop their own theories of so-called linguistic domination, how to incorporate the idea of domination within the discussion on language. So we draw on this work to suggest two ways in which linguistic domination could be a feature of relationships amongst English speakers globally. So linguistic domination in this sense can be experienced by both individuals and collective. So let's start by individuals. So individuals are linguistically dominated when another agent another individual, for instance, is able to exercise uncontrolled and deliberate interference over the linguistic practices of this person at little cost, at very little cost. So, for example, speakers of minoritized language who are routinely expected to switch to the dominant language when communicating with its speakers suffer linguistic domination if speakers of the dominant language can impose their linguistic will upon speakers of the minoritized language, right? As indicated by majority language speakers experiencing little pressure to learn the minority language themselves, right? So more interestingly, from our point of view, this can also be experienced by speakers of majority as well as minoritized languages vis-a-vis English, right? This idea that English speakers can impose their linguistic terms uncontrollably towards the speakers of other languages, even if they are majority languages or big languages like, let's say, French, Spanish, or German. Furthermore, there might even be cases of linguistic domination amongst L1 speakers of English, such as when an L1 English speakers from inner cycle contexts are able to unilaterally impose linguistic terms on L1 English speakers from outer or expanding circle contexts. So, for instance, by requiring the adoption of standardized language varieties in employment settings, for instance. So in these cases, inner circle speakers arguably do not relate as moral equals to outer or expanding circle speakers, since the former can deliberately and at little cost control the terms on which communication occurs between these two people. At the same time, collective level linguistic domination, this is the other dimension of linguistic domination, occurs when one language group, not an individual, but a language group, finds itself at the mercy of another language groups in collective decision making, like for instance, in democratic systems, in elections. A paradigmatic example of this are the experiences of historical or durable or long settled linguistic minorities within a state who lack opportunities to interpret and advance their own linguistic interests because linguistic majorities can unilaterally impose their terms on them, their linguistic terms on them, for instance, using electoral means. Right? They are a demographic majority, so they can demographically impose themselves, their linguistic terms on minorities through democratic means. Arguably, a broadly analogous form of collective domination occurs globally regarding English. This is what we argue, despite the fact that globally there is no global democracy, right? So there is no global procedure to make these decisions. But still, we argue there are a kind of domination problem anyway at the global level. There, speakers of languages others than English have little control over the ascent of English to a position of like in prominence, like hegemony, and speakers of less prestigious varieties of English have few opportunities to contest, to try to stop language ideologies that reinforce the linguistic authority of so-called native speakers of English and standardized versions of English. So empowering people against linguistic domination in order to stop this moral inequality between speakers of in the case English, or speakers of other languages than English vis-a-vis English, will require, in a way, altering the terms on which they relate to those who hold dominating power over them, right? To be able to stop the power of those who hold domination power, dominative power. And the most obvious strategy is to make it more costly or more difficult for dominators to exercise this power, this interference. So, for instance, interpersonal linguistic domination might be countered by requiring English speakers living in non-Anglophone countries to learn local languages, like to force them through policies. Or, for instance, at the collective level, when we talk about collective level linguistic domination, the grip of linguistic ideologies about proper English could be loosened, could be diminished by promoting, like, let's say, counter-ideological projects. So a wider range of people might be empowered to influence how Englishes are spoken, right? And contribute to a more pluralized understanding of English. So another way in which people can relate to one another as equals is epistemically, like, for instance, by ensuring that that identity prejudices based on race, language, amongst other things, do not distort a listener's perception of a speaker's intelligence, for instance, or competence. Or by ensuring that members of marginalized or oppressed groups have meaningful opportunities to speak frankly without fear of being ignored or dismissed by listeners, precisely because of the way they speak, not because of the content, but the way they express themselves. So a crucial linguistic mechanism through which this epistemic relational equality might be undermined is, as is known empirically by the empirical literature, accent bias, right? So in this sense, accent bias could explain an important range of global linguistic relational inequalities, since empirical work that we have at hand suggests that bias against, let's say, foreign accented speakers commonly results in them being perceived as less intelligent, less trustworthy, less competent, etc. And arguably, this could also be applied to L1 English speakers who are stigmatized for not using a high prestige standardized version of English. For instance, English speakers from outer or expanding circle contexts, just like English speakers from socially disfavored groups or regions in inner circle contexts, like, for instance, working class people in England, may find their contributions unfairly dismissed, and may hesitate even before speaking in public context, precisely because they face this kind of disadvantages, right? So even some of them might decide just to not participate in, for instance, submitting an application for a job, just because they anticipate that they will be dismissed in advance because of the way they speak and the way they are perceived. So what measures might be enabled to overcome this accent bias that undermines epistemic equality? Conceivably, one might be adopting this kind of pluricentric model of English, or maybe publicly insisting on the equal validity of different varieties, right, of languages, trying to, in a way, undermine attitudes and ideologies that underpin linguistic discrimination based on these accent biases. In addition, there is also this idea promoted by Yael Pelet and Matteo Bonotti. Yael is today here, that they recommend to encourage a kind of virtue, what they call the virtue of metalinguistic awareness, in the sense of people being able to understand and reflect upon the relationships between linguistic content and form, right? And then to be more like open to these different varieties and try to treat the others as epistemic equals. Another way in which people can relate to one another is in terms of their social standing. This has a lot in common with moral equality, but as you will see, it's a bit different. So for instance, a good example of this, to exemplify what we mean, It's explained by Philippe Bamparet. So he presents an example that illustrates this linguistic inequality. In this example, there is an American executive living in Waterloo, that is a French-speaking suburb in Brussels, Belgium. And this American executive became frustrated because his landlord didn't learn English after 3 years of renting him, right, place. So Bamparais, what argues here is that the executive's failure to learn French on the one hand, and the expectation for the landlord to speak English reflects a kind of broader issue of not treating others as equals. Um, in this case, this behavior of this executive might be seen as a kind of relational egalitarian wrong in terms of social standing, in this case, where this businessman views himself as a kind of a privileged global social class entitled to have his linguistic needs met by others without any kind of reciprocation, right? So without trying himself to learn French at all. So the privilege comes not only from being an English speaker itself, but also from the executive's economic status and, of course, the status of the United States as a global hegemonic power in a way. So in this sense, inequalities in social standing require certain kind of background conditions to support these inequalities, such as in this case hierarchies, like especially intersubjective social hierarchies, in which relations of superiority and inferiority are habitual and are completely normalized. Social hierarchies of the kind that nourish these inegalitarian social relationships can be observed not only between speakers of English and speakers of other languages, as the example that we mentioned by Bamparais, but also between speakers of different varieties of English. In particular, and this is addressed in particular by in applied linguistics by critics of native speakerism, and they have drawn attention to the socially privileged status of certain L1 English speakers. So a common feature of these inequalities is that the relevant linguistic hierarchy, including the intra-linguistic hierarchy between different varieties of English, are part of this broader, big global patchwork of intersecting social hierarchies that are sustained and bolstered by the historic and ongoing effects on colonialism, as well as the current North-South economic and political relations, also questions of racism, etc. So dismantling the social hierarchies that sustain this global social inequality should involve in a way transformation in social norms. This may be support, for example, by critical projects of ideological demythification, right, intended to disturb or displace the assumptions underpinning linguistic hierarchies, right, and also applied to different varieties of English. Or alternatively, new egalitarian social norms might be encouraged, promote through more piecemeal measures such as requiring English speakers to learn other languages beyond English. And finally, a final way in which people might relate to one another as equals is in terms of their aesthetic standing. Like so, in a similar way, like our appearances, physical appearances, the language we use are also subject to, let's say, oppressive and equal undermining aesthetic norms. So, for instance, despite experts in linguistics insist all the time that all languages in a way are functionally equal, in everyday talk, it remains common to hear kind of stigmatizing assumptions about the aesthetic qualities of different languages. Like, for instance, when people declare one language to be more precise than others, more beautiful, more expressive than another. Like, for instance, German is the language of philosophy, or like songs in Italy sounds very, I don't know, romantic, this kind of stuff, you know? So similarly, language prescriptivism continues to hold sway amongst the general public, who laud standardized languages for their superior beauty, clarity, and rationality. And this, of course, also applies to different varieties of English, the same that applies to different languages other than English. So here we distinguish between two pressing types of aesthetic linguistic inequality, connected to this global language system. First, are negative aesthetic judgments directed specifically against foreign accents, right? Whether independently if these are spoken by native or non-native speakers, right? But if an accent is perceived as being foreign, let's say, they are classified as less aesthetically beautiful, etc., right? And second are the aesthetic judgments about the prestige or attractiveness of particular varieties of the same language, such as the belief that inner standardized versions of English are more authoritative, expressive than other varieties, right? And of course, these two kinds of aesthetic inequalities are context dependent, because some varieties of English might look okay in some contexts, but not that okay in some others. So all in all, since these aesthetic linguistic inequalities are sustained by oppressive social norms, dismantling, attacking these social norms will require broad and ambitious projects that to transform dominant language ideologies, as we mentioned before. So just to conclude, let me summarize what have been said so far. So first of all, global linguistic inequalities are complex and multifaceted phenomenon, a pluralist one, as Andy mentioned at the beginning. So disaggregating it into these 9 categories, and probably there are even more, we have revealed how working towards greater linguistic inequality, even in the case we're focusing on, this is the case of equality amongst English speakers, will require a wider range of interventions and public policies, such as anti-discrimination laws, boosting opportunities to learn and use English, encouraging a pluricentric ethos applied to English, requiring native English speakers to learn additional languages, training listeners to better appreciate different language forms and varieties, etc. So, although some of these proposals resemble familiar legislative and public policy measures that we probably have heard in different public life domains, many of them target language, attitudes, and ideologies, right? And not only the common kind of things targeted by linguistic justice theory literature in political theory that usually target language rights, institutions, procedures, etc. Right? But most of what we have said talk about something else. Not only that, all of this is important, but there are also some other things that should be considered when developing these policies, like how we should address language ideologies, social norms, attitudes, etc. So for linguistic justice theories, especially the kind of fine-grained analysis of language inequality that we have attempted to do here. So this analysis that we have developed here suggests an important limitation of existing theories so far, at least in political theory, that all of them are theories based, or most of them are theories based on rights, procedures, institutions, and this is not enough. This is one of the points we would like to make with the paper. So our analysis suggests that egalitarians have good reasons to look beyond beyond, to go, not to focus only on language rights, etc., but to also focus on other kind of stuff. And these papers is, in this sense, a first step towards opening these discussions and the kind of policies we should develop, and the kind of arguments that can justify them all if we try to approach or try to argue in favor of a more egalitarian world, let's say. And that's it. Thank you so much. Moltes gracias.